And there was a band by the name of Chicago. How many geriatric rockers do we have here? Ah, yes. Any? No, you never heard of Chicago? It's not a city, it's a band. There's a band Chicago, and they sang this song. And Andre, you'll start singing it as soon as I. Okay. Does anybody know what time it is? Right? You remember? Ah, Wendy's going. Does anybody know what time it is? Does anybody really care? Several months ago, I did something like that, and I just hummed a few bars of a song, and YouTube put a copyright notice on it. I didn't think I was that good. Anyways, does anybody really know what time it is? It's really a song about people who have watches, but don't know what time it is. So some of the words are, as I was walking down the street one day, a man came up to me and asked me, what time was that on my watch? And a pretty lady looked at me and said her diamond watch had stopped cold dead. And the songs go on. You know, today we not only have our watches, now we have smart watches that do more than just tell us the time. Some people wish they would just tell us the time. We have our phones. We're very conscious, maybe more conscious now of time. I don't know. Calendars, clocks, watches, phones are our modern masters. Easy available to check both on our smartphones, on our smart watches. Every church that I have ministered in has always had at the back, where only the minister can see it, a clock. Always strategically located. You can't see it, but I am constantly looking at the clock. And let me tell you, I'm pretty confident today that this game will be ending early. So, does anyone know what time it is? There's an Old Testament text, Book of Ecclesiastes, helps answer that question. If you can find Ecclesiastes in your Old Testament, it's one of those books that we know it's there, but we're not quite sure what to do with it. Some people talk about it as being the Bible's alien book. It is quite different from many of the other books of the Bible, even many of the other Old Testament books of the Bible that you might be familiar with. And it kind of leaves you read through Ecclesiastes and you're left with this distinctive feeling that, well, you might say, does this really belong in the Bible, this book? Was this just glued in when I wasn't looking? Because there are few, if any, verses, passages in Ecclesiastes that you will find on fridge magnets or cross-stitch wall hangings. Okay, not too many. There are, and I, off the top of my head, I can't think of any, but I don't want to say for sure, because I don't know. I haven't researched carefully. But let me just say, I suspect there are very few hymns based on Ecclesiastes. It's not a book that sings well, okay? Ecclesiastes is part of that Old Testament genre that is called wisdom literature. Books like Proverbs, books like Job, we think of as wisdom literature. And by tradition, the author of Ecclesiastes has been identified as Solomon, the wise king was his reputation. And that's mainly because of the information that's given in the opening 2 verses of the book. In the first couple of verses of Ecclesiastes, the author is identified as, depends on your translation, the Hebrew term is Koheleth, and it's often translated as teacher, sometimes as preacher. And he's described as being the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. But nowhere in Ecclesiastes is Solomon explicitly identified as the author. And that title, Son of David, is so general that it could refer to anyone who is somehow related to David. So we're not totally sure that the tradition of Ecclesiastes being written by Solomon is accurate or not. Nothing wrong with that idea, but I'm just saying we don't know for sure. The bulk of Ecclesiastes, that's really not important. The bulk of Ecclesiastes describes what the teacher has learned from careful observation, just looking around, watching life go on, and years of experience and accumulated wisdom. You see, wisdom in the Bible, and I think it's true when we think of wisdom today, wisdom is not smarts. Wisdom is not knowing how to fix something or how to do something. Wisdom is that accumulated experience. That's wisdom. How to respond, how to act. And so Ecclesiastes is that. And it's mostly interested in life and what we learn from living life. And so in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, if you're familiar with anything from Ecclesiastes, it's probably this passage. This could probably fit on a fridge magnet, or maybe somebody could not crochet it, needlepoint it. In Ecclesiastes 3, the teacher insists, in the NIV, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. That's common sense, isn't it? I mean, that doesn't take a lot of wisdom to say, yeah. And so, time for everything, a season for every activity under the heavens. Got it. But he goes on. And what the teacher is calling on us to do is the more challenging than that. He is saying, you need to figure out which time is which. There's a time for everything. It's a season for every activity under the heavens. You always know what time it is. But which time is it? A wise one knows whether it's a time to be born or a time to die. The wise person knows, is this a time to weep or is this a time to laugh? A time to mourn or a time to dance? And so you get this long list, right, in verses 1 through 8 of these descriptive times. And they're really a reflection on the way that life goes. So, for example, the second verse of chapter 3 reminds us that there are times when children enter the world. There's a time to be born. There's also a time when we leave this world. There's a time to be born and a time to die. Of course, we don't get to choose those times, right? Few of us would, for example, choose to weep with pain, or mourn with sadness, or even die. And frankly, none of us chooses the time of our birth. And oftentimes, we don't understand, why does God let things happen when they happen? Why does God let happen what happens? We'll never understand. Why does there have to be a time for a child to be buried by a parent? Why is there a time for a parent to bury a child? Why is there a time for an aunt to grieve a young nephew's death? Why? Why those times? We don't choose those things. They are, in some ways, they choose us. But we do get to choose some of the times that the teacher describes in this list, right? We don't usually get to choose when we mourn, But we do get to choose to some extent when we get to dance again. It's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Things happen to you, things happen to me that make us weep. But we get to choose, at least to some extent, when we're ready to laugh again. Evil makes us hate it, but we get to choose when we will love rather than hate. It's a time to love and a time to hate. God gives us the freedom to make choices about how we respond to what happens to us. We can choose to live into the time that we have been given and to find the holiness that exists in nearly all of it. And so Ecclesiastes' teacher or preacher reminds us that God is the initiator and we are the responder. God is the author not just of grace, but also of every good gift. And so we respond to those gifts with our faith, and that is another good gift from God. The wise person always knows what time it is. The wise person knows what and when something is worth fighting for, and when it's time just to let certain things slide. It's not worth the battle. And so, for example, verse 7, it's not merely reflecting the obvious fact that sometimes we will be talking and sometimes we will be silent, a time to be silent and a time to speak. I mean, that's obvious. What the teacher is trying to get at, wisdom's call for us, is to discern when we're best just to listen in silence. You know, my job description is, right? Just listen in silence, as opposed to filling the air with our own speech. There are occasions when you can speak a word which will really help. But there are other occasions when no matter what you say, you'll make matters worse, right? You've been there. Wisdom can tell the difference. Wise people know what time it is. The rest of Ecclesiastes, of this passage in Ecclesiastes, reminds us that our time is short. If we're alive, we were born. But if we're born, we will also, unless Jesus comes back before, we will also die. Period. The time between the maternity ward and the funeral home is a kind of in the meantime scenario. And it's really more than just a blink of the eye. So what do we do with that little bit of time that God has given us? Well, you go down a few more verses to verses 11 and 12, and the teacher invites us to be happy, do good while we live, and to eat and drink and find satisfaction in all of our toil. On the one hand, the teacher invites us to do good and to find satisfaction in our work. Okay? And on the other hand, we're also invited to be happy as well as to eat and drink. Wise people know when it's time to do one or the other. And we also know, wise people also know when we need to do both. The wise person looks for work that is meaningful, work that will put bread and drink on the table. But the wise person also makes sure that he or she finds the time to enjoy the bread and the drink. And so on this 365th day of the year of our Lord, 2023, Ecclesiastes tells us that we need to know what time it is. Do we need to take more time in 2024 to find satisfaction in our labor, in our toil? Or do we need to take more time to enjoy God's gifts? Historically, people have usually chosen work over enjoyment. And so there's the image of figuratively, if not literally, of children who have absentee parents, right? And sometimes those children will seek attention elsewhere because their parents can't or just won't take time away from their work. Workaholic, right? It's the term that we use for people who seem to almost work compulsively, just like some people abuse drugs or alcohol. Some do that because they feel guilty if they don't somehow work long hours. Others work long hours because it somehow feeds some need that they have. And there are also others that work long hours because they have bosses or superiors who expect them to do that. But this morning, the teacher reminds us that truly wise people know when it's time to work and when it's time to enjoy the fruit of that work. Maybe some of us need to learn that in 2024. But the teacher also throws a bit of a wrench into this wisdom that he gives us here. In verses 10 and 11 that's on the screen here, the teacher adds these words: I have seen the burden that God has laid on the human race. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. The teacher reminds us here, God created us in time. And we are creatures of time. And yet, smack in the middle of that discussion about how we're creatures of time, he throws in a little word: eternity. Eternity. This whole chapter, Ecclesiastes 3, centers on our finite time as human beings. And yet, right in the middle of it all comes this word, eternity. And in this sense, the word eternal is not up there in the clouds. Oftentimes when we think of eternity, we think of beyond this time. But it's right here, God says. It's right here in the human heart. He has created eternity. He has set eternity in the human heart. God has given us a sense of something more. Somebody has said that what God has said in us, we hear echoes. We hear echoes from a far country. And we now and again catch the sound of a few notes to a tune that we've never really heard in its entirety. And yet we have this feeling that one day we're going to hear that whole song play from beginning to end. And we're going to recognize that medley instantly. To say it another way, we're quite certain that there is something more beyond just us. I know there are people who will deny it, but I want to suggest to you that for the vast majority of people that you know, if you don't even have to probe deep, that they all have that sense there's got to be something more than just beyond us. Something more beyond our watches, our calendars, our day timers, our history books. There's something else out there. And we know that because, as the teacher says, God has set that into our hearts. There's no way around the fact that time will not stop, and that unless Christ returns first, we will die. Death will be for each of us either the end or a beginning. And it's eternity that gives your death meaning. Is it a beginning? What's it like to die while ignoring that sense of eternity that God puts in our hearts? How can life be fully meaningful if, in the long run, this is all there is, and we just simply, when we die, we're dead, and we're never remembered by God, and we're soon forgotten by virtually everyone. It's a bit like watching, someone has said, it's a bit like watching somebody enjoy a dinner of the finest steak, and then watching that person die because the steak poisoned her. Would you say, well, at least her steak tasted good? That's something, isn't it? Death still sometimes packs a powerful wallop. It's a venomous enough sting, even for those who recognize the eternity that God has set in our hearts. But that wallop, that sting, cannot help but feel fatal for those who choose to ignore or to suppress that eternity that God has set in the human heart. As verse 11 puts it, we will never understand what God has done from beginning to end. We cannot fathom the death of people that we love. As we begin a new calendar year, we know this year will not be free of death or tragedy. Won't be freer of death or tragedy than the year that's just gone by, or any period of human history. There are no easy answers. There's no sugar-coated cliches that I can give you that makes life better. But we can handle life a little better because we know the one who is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end of all things, Jesus Christ. And we can move into a new year in faith that God is at work in time and in eternity. And we can give thanks to the God who graciously gives us the time that we have. And we can be wise people and know what time it is. We have eternity set in our hearts, where we can move forward in life, listening for that eternal melody that we can hear from God's far country. And we can sing along as best we can as we hear snippets of God's life-affirming music. There's a time for everything, but there's also an eternity for everyone. And for that, we give God our thanks.